call this talk Language and Context, which I think is sort of the essence of how we do this thing. And I hope that you'll find value in this talk. I won't be talking about value objects today. Now, on this slide, I use the word I twice, and I think that it means the same thing in both cases. And I use the word talk, and I use the word talking, and I think their meanings are very related in the sense that we sort of, when we're coming up with systems, we often have this sort of thing and the making of a thing or the happening of a thing. So this is the same concept with the same word, but one is the thing and one is the event or something like that. And then I use the word value twice. But this time, the word value doesn't mean the same thing in both sentences. It's two different meanings of the word value. So I copied this from the dictionary. So the first time I used the word value, I would say that it's this first definition, that something that would be held to deserve the importance, worth, or usefulness of something. So that sounds like, I hope that you will get value from this talk. And then the second one, the value object, the exact definition of that isn't on this, but it's pretty closely related to this numerical amount, the value of denoted by an algebraic term. If you look up more mathematical definitions of value, you'll find something like that. And there are other meanings that are kind of intriguing too, specific to music, and there are a lot of meanings to the word value. So you could say that we have a definition of value in the context of this statement, and we have a definition of value in the context of this statement. We say this all the time. You took a comment out of context, and therefore it was misunderstood. So the boundary of understanding the word value in that first statement is just the statement. When we're just talking to each other, that's good enough, because people are just incredibly good at inferring context from the surrounding sentences or the physical environment or whatever. Software is not so good at that. Now, of course, we have multiple definitions of value in the context of this slide. So if we were to look at this slide, we couldn't actually unambiguously say what the word value means. Now, we could say, well, let's get rid of this ambiguous meaning. We'll come up with one definition of value, and we'll use a different word for the other. Here's the thesaurus for value, valuable, close enough. Useful, worthwhile, these seem like pretty good synonyms. We could go back and change the sentence. I hope you'll find this talk worthwhile. It doesn't mean exactly the same as value. It's changed the meaning a little bit. And maybe I really wanted that other meaning. But if it's very important to me to eliminate all ambiguity within the context of this slide, then that would be the sort of change that I might have to make. And so now we have a single definition of value within the context of this slide. Now, bounded context, that's what it is. You choose some boundary, and you say, we're going to eliminate the ambiguity within this context, within the context enclosed by this boundary. It could be a slide, or it could be all the code and the databases of a certain subsystem, or it could be some set of microservice interfaces and messages. It could be almost anything, and I think the fact that it could be almost anything is part of why it's sort of a difficult concept to grasp. But the really essential aspect is someone working in it should always be able to easily know they're in it or they're not in it, right? Whatever that boundary is, it's something that a developer can easily see and something that other people who participate in the design process can easily see as well. And then we talk about, well, within one of these bounded contexts, we're going to explore some models of the domain, and we're going to refine our language and develop the ubiquitous language, and we're going to get a more expressive and clear language. And of course, we will try to focus on the core domain, try to distill certain aspects of the domain that have particular differentiating value to our organization. So that is kind of the way that we talk about it most of the time. And it's very tidy to say, well, you know, we'll have a lot of models. We're going to have multiple models to address different problems that we have. So we'll have multiple models, multiple languages. They'll be isolated from each other in multiple bounded contexts. And, you know, each one focused on a distinct set of problems. And it's so tidy, but I mean, it's a great, I think it sort of guides my work. But any description of a real software system that's that tidy makes me very suspicious. Nothing's that tidy. Certainly none of the software systems, none of the large software systems that I've ever been involved with are anywhere near that tidy. Now, I feel like then we have a bit more work to do. And one of those areas of work is that bounded context still needs to be, I mean, I think we've gotten a lot out of it. And the community's gotten a lot more interested in it over the years, which is very good. So now let's see if we can sort of take that to the next level. And for example, one of the common confusions is between bounded context and subdomain. And yeah, I mean, what is that distinction anyway? So here's one reason I think that it's so confusing. Because in the ideal situation, they coincide almost exactly. In the ideal situation, here's an example. Let's imagine some kind of bank. And in this bank, we have cash accounts and we have credit cards. And so we've got a department that handles cash accounts and a department that handles credit cards. The organization is defined, is structured around that concept of how the domain breaks down. That is to say, those subdomains, right? That credit cards is a subdomain of the domain of banking. Cash accounts is a subdomain of the domain of banking. And we have the organization structured around that. And the software is structured around that. And everything's neat. And it is hard to then say, well, what's the difference between a bounded context and a subdomain? But then, as things do, concepts start to change in the business. They say, we need to align ourselves with market segments, not with types of accounts. So what we're going to do is have business accounts, and we'll have personal accounts. So those are the subdomains that we want our focus to be on. The domain of banking will be broken into business accounts, personal accounts. Now, at this point, that's the subdomains that the business wants to use. But what are the bounded contexts? Well, the bounded contexts are cash account and credit card account, right? Nothing has changed in the software. The software doesn't magically realign itself with the subdomains every time the business changes its mind about how they want to think about their own domain. Now, we can reorganize, and sometimes the people can be reorganized a lot faster than the software can. So we form new teams around the new subdomains. So we have a business accounts team and a personal accounts team, and each one needs credit cards and cash accounts. So the stewardship of these parts of the system become very unclear. So, the business people need a multi-check deposit, and they add it. And the personal accounts team wants the ability to put a hold on very large deposits for a period of time. And they make changes that the other might not care much about, and things are all right. Now, there is a game that I think is pretty international called the three-legged race. And the three-legged race is determined by a kind of balance of coordination and speed. So these two kids that are winning probably are reasonably fast runners, and they are good at coordinating their movements. Maybe these two are good at coordinating their movements, but they're just not as fast. And, maybe these two were not as good at coordinating movements. They might be the fastest runners, we don't know. Okay, so this is a good metaphor for software development where two different teams have to work on the same piece of software. And what would a trip and fall look like here? So, we talked about how the business account team was adding a few things, and the credit and the personal account is adding a few things, and then the business account adds some more things, and the credit. This is how we get the big ball of mud. It's one way. I think there are many paths that lead to the big ball of mud. It's one of those great attractors, but still, this is one perhaps we could do something about. Ignoring this distinction between the subdomains and the bounded context leads us to this kind of neglect of the integrity of these different parts of the system. So, the big ball of mud is one of those great patterns that predates domain-driven design. And my instinct about that is I just sort of want to avoid it. But I think that the one thing I've said many times in past presentations is that it's a bad strategy to say, well, we're just going to clean up everything, build everything new. That big ball of mud is there, and it's there to stay, at least for the foreseeable future. So I talked about things like bubble context. Bubble context is where, all right, the business is really run by the big ball of mud, but I can kind of create this bubble, and in the bubble, I can do elegant design. And the bubble doesn't have very much in it. It's not a complete ground-up system. It's just the part I want to do, just the part focused on the core domain, but it has possibly massive translation layers. The translation layers of a bubble context might well be bigger, more software than the logic contained within it. That would be a normal thing. And there might be different degrees of commitment to a bubble context. Everything from this thing doesn't contain any data at all, so all the old stuff can continue running as if it weren't even there. No one will even notice it unless they're using it. But you might have scaling problems that way, and you could at some point say, we will asynchronously duplicate data into this bubble, and that's what I call the autonomous bubble context, and so on. It could evolve to the point where maybe that starts to become, a few of those start to become the center of a new, sort of the new center of the overall software system. So there's a kind of a path to escape from the big ball of mud. And yet I realize, and I've seen this for a long time, that I and almost all software people, as far as I can see, most, we talk about legacy systems, big balls of mud. We talk about them in such a negative way, such a negative framing, that I think this keeps us from coming up with really the best solutions that we might be able to. This is a picture that was in a presentation by Rebecca Wurzbach a couple of years ago, I think at this conference, and I liked it. She was pointing out that this old tree, so this picture she took in Japan of this very old pine tree that, and it's one of those beautiful, very Japanese things where they've nurtured this tree for hundreds of years, and it's propped up, it can't, it's got those sort of wrappers around and poles holding it up. And there's an aesthetic there. And you could say, well, why do we value this tree? I mean, why not just cut that tree down and plant a new tree there that would be perfectly straight, capable of holding up its own weight, right? It would be in every way a superior tree by the sort of criteria that we usually use to evaluate software systems. So can we shift our aesthetic a little bit? Because I, for one, would consider it a crime to do that. I think most of the people here would agree with me. There's something about this tree that's very rich and valuable. I think some of our legacy software systems have a bit of that, if we could see it. And so I thought, well, the way we talk about bounded context, we characterize them in certain ways, but big ball of mud is one very vivid way, and I think it's a good designation. But maybe we could have other ones. If you think about, again, going to plants and gardening, I observed that when you look at a garden that's been recently planted, it's very tidy. You can see each plant, and there are no weeds and anything. But actually, you don't get much out of a garden like that, right? The time that you get the things out of it is here, a few months later, when it is very messy, right? It's full of weeds, and the plants have kind of overgrown into each other. This is when you get the harvest of a garden. And so maybe some contexts we should think of as mature, productive contexts. So we could think about, well, what is the connection then between this context and the core domain? Does this particular legacy system provide specific services within that core? Or what of the other routine responsibilities does it take care of? Maybe things that are not core, maybe things we would rather not have to worry about. Let's think of it in terms of, all right, here's some stuff off our shelf. And then the part that is core, and this is pretty important, how is it aligned or misaligned with the current business view of the core domain, or of the domain? Because that shifts all the time, just like I was, in my example earlier with the bank accounts. And so this mature context, although it may actually be quite nicely designed, or it may have, started to get some entropy, but either way, it's producing value. It's probably built on a concept of the core domain that's a bit outdated. So how much is it constraining the way they want to evolve their business? I think that part is often the motivation for trying to replace legacy systems or escape from them in one way or another. Because there are a lot of systems, and if they just kept cranking away doing the thing that they do, people might be happy, but then they want to do something different. But that's not across the board. That's a misalignment with very specific things. And of course, that could lead to a bubble context. Could lead to transforming the existing context, but usually those kind of contexts just don't transform very well. In fact, I think when you try to change the basic assumptions of a software system, that just doesn't usually work out. And often what you do is just break it, and you kind of turn it into a big ball of mud. As I was playing around, so I mentioned I like language. I think playing around with words and phrases is a lot of what makes domain-driven design work well. Thinking about different ways to talk about the domain. So if we're thinking about legacy systems, perhaps we think of other words we use for old things that we value. How about quaint? I don't know. I realized it It's not a native English-speaking audience mostly, but quaint has a very strongly positive connotation. It's about old things. Now, a quaint context presumably does useful work. But what makes it quaint? Maybe it has old-fashioned technology. Sometimes the motivation for replacing old systems is more technological, that we don't want, these mainframe systems or whatever. Or maybe it's not aligned with the current view of the domain, in particular the core domain. And maybe it can still be modified within limits. But again, as I say, major conceptual changes would probably push it over into a big ball of mud. Now, some contexts are big balls of mud, and we can just label as that. But some of them might be usefully described in other ways, and it can make us think. It can make us come up with better strategies. There might be a way of describing a context where we just applied patch on patch on patch until it's mostly patches. And that would point us toward ways in which we might change or not change it. It would say, you can do bug fixes here if you're very precise, but don't try to make any meaningful improvements in the business logic or something. Whereas maybe a quaint context can be still changed as long as you don't try to change the basic concept of it. And we could have, start to think about these in combination. Like, we're trying to experiment with a really radically different concept of the domain. Let's create a bubble, but we'll keep the business going with the quaint context, and etc. But we might talk about some mistakes we made. We started trying to change the quaint context, and then we pushed it over the edge, and it's now a big ball of mud. I don't know. I am just kind of experimenting here, right? But this is an area where I think we could do a lot. Now, there are some people who are better, braver and better when it comes to actually transforming legacy systems. And I also think we ought to, listen to those people. My tendency, and I do think, by the way, that this is often the right thing to do, is to say if we have something really important that is really conceptually different, that we should create a bubble and work on it there. But the limits of transformation of quaint context or mature legacy systems might be more than I think of. And also, as long as you're not changing those basics, maybe you'd be able to keep them alive so that we can continue to draw upon their relatively mundane capabilities and not have to rebuild those. That would be a big win. And I know that all of this is, in a certain way, quite obvious. But if we can sort of bring it into the forefront of our thinking about context mapping and bounded context, perhaps that would be better still. So there could be other kinds of contexts. There are, and we draw them, but we don't really explicitly label them. So it could be helpful, maybe, to be more explicit about, why would this be a context? One of the motivations sometimes to try to establish a boundary is to say, here's a generic subdomain, and we are going to address that generic subdomain in a separate context. This is, by generic, it just means something, that everybody does, or the great range of businesses and so forth do. There's nothing special about our business, and we want to approach this in a conventional way. Well, to do that, the best way, I believe, is to have a context, a boundary in which we address that problem, and nothing else. We try to keep it very generic. By labeling it as such, it might make it easier, because what tends to happen is that when we start, it might be generic, but we start to solve our own problem within that context. So instead of being let's say, a routing algorithm in the context, it becomes, our particular routing algorithm. And we lose the genericity of it. I think that's actually something that might be improved by just being more explicit about the motivation of separating it in the first place. Of course, then there's the off-the-shelf kind of generic context. It's easier to see the boundaries when you're getting something off the shelf. Sometimes you buy it, sometimes it's an open source thing or whatever. But of course, you don't have control of these. But assuming that the people who are the stewards of them are good stewards, these are the ideal kinds of generic subdomain contexts, I think. And of course, then we must conform when we work in our more specialized context, but as we address those issues, we have to conform to the concepts within those contexts. Or we have to make anti-corruption layers, lots of translation. Generally speaking, it would be better to conform to the generic stuff. And so we might want to be explicit about that. In the context mapping, as I described it in my book, we do label relationships as conformist, but I think within the downstream into that, it might be good to say, well, just what are we conforming to? Just these concepts within our model are actually following in lockstep behind the concepts of that context. When you conform to another context, you might need a little more detailed information than that. Could have the motivation as well. So more description of this kind could really be helpful. Here's another kind of motivator. Often I find that we want to separate contexts and have sort of generalist sort of contexts and specialist ones. And by that I mean some of the kinds of problems that you do are the sort of thing that everyone in business would easily understand. And if we kind of produce a rough and ready model of it, everybody will be pretty happy. In e-commerce, we've got shopping carts and checkout process and all that sort of thing, very generalist. Everybody, even the customers, will understand these concepts quite easily. And I think generalist context can be a little bit bigger. Meanwhile, we have these very specialized ones that may be more esoteric, like, say, fraud detection with machine learning, where you're going to do things that the customer wouldn't understand. In fact, most of the people in the business won't understand what's going on in there. I think generally you want to keep those small so that the degree of lumping versus splitting, is guided by these kind of things. Well then, maybe as we make those decisions and as we describe our contexts, we could include this kind of explanation. So if we could expand the language a little bit to describe bounded context and the motivations, it could help us to make the decisions, but also to understand the decisions of the past and follow them or knowingly depart from them. This one is pretty closely related to generalist specialist, but say the level of rigor. Sometimes you're dealing with something that's almost mathematical or is mathematical. Routing algorithms or something. Sometimes you want some flexibility, like maybe the shopping cart scenario, and you might want a little flexibility in what could be included in a shopping cart. And then at the other end, you've got, your big ball of mud. It's just a mess, and there's no rigor at all. So you could just observe and describe, or you could convey the intention. In this context, we want to be rigorous. In this context, we have a degree of flexibility. This would be useful, I think, because the people working in it and assuming that they know that they are, what context they're in, will have guidance as to what style of work they should be doing there. I think we really do shift and should shift. We don't always want to do our most rigorous design. For one thing, it would just take too much time, but for another, it isn't really appropriate to every problem. And there could be many others. Once there was this context that I was looking at, and I thought the perfect name for it would be the House of Cards. There was a kind of elegance to the thing, but you could see that the slightest change could just bring the whole thing down. So, if it could convey something, we could have a richer vocabulary. Now, some of the things that we usually talk about as things that are oriented around teams, I think would be better oriented around bounded context. Like, say, say how we do testing. Sometimes we'll have teams that are very test-oriented. And everything that team does, they want lots of tests. Whereas maybe another team isn't that serious about it. Really, I think the thing that should be designated as high tests or fewer tests should be specific bounded context. In this bounded context, we have decided that we're going to have high test coverage. That means whoever you are, if you're working in this context, you have to write good tests. But if you're working in another context, maybe that's not expected. Or architectural styles. This context uses hexagonal architecture, or the DDD building blocks, or some other kind of building blocks that people might use to structure their fine-grained design. This context uses event sourcing. This context uses some other thing. So basically, we could do a bit more, I think, around this, and then think about the stewardship, right? If we have a bounded context where we expect some rigor, we want to give stewardship of it to a team that's capable of maintaining a rigorous design. You think about the capability of a team, and should they have stewardship of this context? This context was set up to have high test coverage. If we give it to a team, if we are shifting our stewardship around, we want to make sure that the team that's responsible for it is one that can do good tests and values that. If we are shifting, a high-risk moment is, of course, when the boundaries of the subdomains as the business people see them are shifting. If we are really aware of the existing context, we can assign stewardship of the ones that we have and plot an actual strategy toward handling the new vision, whether that be transforming the existing context or creating new ones. And so if we could have a more complete kind of description, and I shouldn't even use the word complete because I don't believe that we would ever have a complete description or even want one, but let's just say a richer description, a more informative one of the context that we have. Okay. Now I'm going to talk about microservices. They should play that triumphant song again. Every time they play that at the beginning, I think I should look up at the ceiling and see which tributes have been killed. But anyway, but microservices should probably get that sound, and for all the reasons. It's the biggest opportunity we've had, it's the biggest risk we've had for a long time. It's like this is really, it's probably the biggest single factor. I don't suppose there are, is a single reason that domain-driven design has kind of had a little surge lately, but it's probably the single biggest one. And the thing that they're most interested in is bounded context. And turning it around, the thing that we should be most interested in about microservices is the capabilities it gives us to fulfill the needs of our business, as we focus on domains. And when I heard about microservices, I thought, there are some things about this that just really could be helpful, So I want to talk about this. Now, a thing like this can get so big that it for one thing, it kind of loses focus. So what does microservices mean? It can mean many things to many people. Hopefully, my sense of what I mean will come across as I talk about it. Another thing is that I, among many people, have a sort of automatic resistance to things that get that, that bandwagon effect, where everyone's getting the bandwagon, and it's more than people aren't choosing to do it, they're just jumping on the bandwagon. So those, I think, are all legitimate concerns, but shouldn't stop us from taking advantage of something that actually has some good stuff in it. Not to mention that this is a real bandwagon. You know that expression, jumping on the bandwagon? This is what it actually comes from. Some kind of 19th century, very fun-looking thing. And so, who wouldn't want to jump on a bandwagon if it were like that? All right. But the thing is that people talk about microservices and bounded context, and they say, a microservice is a bounded context. And I think that's just way too simple, Sometimes it seems almost to be true. So I think that there are, you could say, kind of 4 kinds of contexts involving microservices. One would be inside of a service. That is, how does the service actually work? And another would be the API of that service. So how does it talk to the other services, right? And another would be clusters of services. Not a single one, but not the entire system. And another would be interactions between the services in their own right. And I'll talk about each of these briefly, very briefly. Service internal. That's the one that people think of, I think, when they say, a microservice is a bounded context. And there's an autonomous team. They can duplicate the data that they're going to use if they need to. They can isolate it, and in fact, no one's allowed to touch anything in someone else's service. And this is really, clearly fits my definition of bounded context. But it isn't the only aspect of microservices. If you just had this, there would be a proliferation of services that would not even know how to talk to each other. So that's not really enough. Now, people talk about the API of the service sort of like, that autonomous team builds the API of their service, so presumably it can do whatever they want. So they can, I guess anyone who uses their service is going to just have to, conform to them or transform. And then that must mean that services that they use, which are upstream of them, they just have to accommodate whatever those people come up with. So that would imply that all the development decisions are pretty much dictated by the data flow direction. If you take data from me, you have to follow my lead, and so on. And I just don't think that's probably what happens when this works well. I mean, yes, this happens some. And this might be perfectly fine as a default sort of rule. But it isn't the only thing going on. Another way of looking at the API, perhaps, is that we have the same kinds of sort of power relationships between different groups building different microservices that we have in all the other systems that we've seen. And a highly influential group is going to create an API that other teams have to conform to, whether they are consuming it or whether they are sending information to it. If you are writing software, tax software, and you have to submit a form to the tax authority, you conform to the tax authority. It doesn't matter what direction the data is flowing. You don't tell the IRS, you're downstream of us, the data flow is going to you, so here's the tax form the way I decided to format it. That's just not the reality of the world, and it's not the reality of software systems. So these relationships, like upstream, downstream, conformist, and so on, can be used to describe what's really going on in terms of how did these APIs get worked out. It's more complicated than the way it's often described, I do believe. And what little I've seen, and I haven't seen everything, but I've seen some, though. Another thing that I think is happening, and it should happen, is that there are clusters of services being designed in close collaboration. So even though there might be someone who, now of course in some cases there might be a team that builds more than one service. So they build several services and each one is designed to work with the others to accomplish some job or set of jobs. And that's a bounded context. The individual services then aren't the bounded context. It's that cluster that was designed together by the same people or a close collaboration of some kind. At least the APIs. It's possible that the internals then are quite different, right? It is quite possible and common that the internal model of a service would be very different from the model used in the API. But I'm mostly talking about the APIs. Another way to look at it is the interaction itself. That part has to be modeled, and that model has to be some kind of collaboration. Or it doesn't have to be, because you could do the I'm upstream, you're downstream thing, though I think there could be some loops somewhere. But I think that if you want good results, you're going to see that there are parts of the system designated with basically protocols of interaction. And that the messages that are sent with them among these, to participate in this protocol of interaction, you need to use these messages. You need to use these kind of schemas to describe the data that you're sending back and forth. Now, what you do with it inside your service is your business, and that's a different context. So what I'm talking about here is not saying, okay, here's how it's done. This is the way to do microservices. This is the way they do it. I'm saying it's more meant to be the beginning of that conversation. Let's really take seriously this idea that bounded context would be a good tool for thinking about microservices, that microservices would be a good way to deliver rich domain kind of software, and then say, how do we describe the good outcomes in terms of bounded context? I think some of these things will help. Another thing is that the legacy systems aren't going away. Remember the legacy systems? And so we want them to be able to participate in a microservices system. And of course, they are not microservices, and they aren't designed to work that way. So there are ways that we can at least draw upon some of their capabilities. I've worked with teams that have done this kind of stuff, like create an interface which looks just like a microservice, so that it can fully participate in the microservices interactions that are happening. But behind the scenes, it doesn't resemble the conventional description. It mostly does queries against the legacy system and transforms that data into whatever form it's expected. Or if it's meant to be messages, and the legacy system most likely does not produce messages, then there are tricks that you can use to kind of create messages that describe what's happening in that system. For example, on one or maybe two projects that I was involved in, they put database triggers in, and every time there was an update to this particular table, they would create an event. Well, they would first create an entry in another table that was essentially a table where every row was an event, and then they would read that table and produce messages that would be published into the microservices environment. And so effectively, what you have is, and of course there was a translation, the terminology and the structure of the data was completely different as it was turned into those messages. So what you have there is a legacy context participating in the microservices collaborations and protocols, but through translators and so on. This is almost like a bubble in reverse. And it keeps us from corrupting the new stuff. And when I wrote the anti-corruption layer pattern, I was mostly thinking about the new stuff. I was even more oriented toward that then than now. So I thought, well, I don't want those legacy concepts to corrupt my new concepts and my new architecture. But that goes both ways, because these legacy systems do such valuable work, but as I pointed out, they are in some ways fragile too. And they can be corrupted and turned into a big ball of mud if we're not careful. So it's like it's a buffer, protects both. So I think bounded context is a place where there's just a lot of potential to go deeper, a little richer, figure out ways to deal with legacy, or to even think about it in a nicer way. Ways of thinking about microservices that would be more productive, and ways of classifying our more classical sorts of bounded contexts, even the ones that would be developed in a DDD way, but is this intended to be generic? Is it intended to be specialized? So on. It could kind of evolve into a sort of context mapping 2.0. Or maybe there are tools that could be created to make it a bit more tangible. I always am skeptical of tools to deal with things like this, but it's possible. Well, so moving on to, okay, here we are at a conference, and I wrote this book 15 years ago. That seems barely possible to me in two different ways. Barely possible that it could have been 15 years, but also barely possible that this is still, actually bigger than it's been after 15 years, that it's the biggest that it's been. That's sort of surprising. And I think that, maybe it's time to define what domain-driven design is. I say this a little jokingly because for many years, and more than 15 years, people keep asking me, well, what's really the definition of DDD? And the definitions I propose, they point out, quite rightly, are a little bit loose. And so I've thought about this a lot for a long time. What should this definition be? And then, and how tight should that definition be? Like, you can have this kind of spectrum of rigor. You've got things that are defined in a way that helps us produce valuable software. But if you get too tight, sometimes it just turns into a sort of cookbook. If you get too loose, it's just kind of hand-wavy good advice that no one could really argue with. And then on the one extreme, things become very sophisticated but completely irrelevant. And on the other extreme, it just makes everyone feel good. But it's totally useless. So I want to stay in the sweet spot. But what is the sweet spot for domain-driven design? Somewhere on that spectrum would be the right place for that definition. And I think there would be things that would be a little more rigorous. Ubiquitous language is probably more specifically defined than DDD itself. Bounded context is even, I think I hope that we can make a pretty specific definition. There are things like subdomain that are in there somewhere. The core domain, that's a little bit hard to put your finger on, but it's important. Then you've got extremely rigorous things. In the book is closure of operations. That one is as rigorous as it could possibly be. It's, I drew it out of mathematics. At the other end, you've got concepts like happiness. This illustrates the point of why you wouldn't want an overly tight definition. Because, people might try to define happiness very rigorously, and it would almost surely lead to something terrible, right? In fact, people have done this many times. And it almost always leads to something terrible. I think if I wrote down my idea of happiness, probably I'd realize that just shooting heroin would give me that. And yet, so I know there's something wrong with that definition. So, or I hope. So then, we want a definition that lets us share a common vision and a language, because we need to have that. So we do need some sort of definition. It can't just be a club that we, are happy members of. But yet, it can't be so tight that we can't innovate and improve DDD the way we do it, even the way we think about it. I think part of the reason that DDD is still interesting to people 15 years later is that we've kept close enough to that sweet spot. It hasn't become feel-good mush, and it hasn't become this sort of doctrine that's so rigid that you just are, following it but don't have any room. We need that room for innovation and some dissent to keep the thing alive. And, and it has stayed alive. It hasn't changed. It hasn't stopped changing. One of the first things that happened after my book came out was event sourcing, and CQRS came on the scene and really changed the way people built systems using but still, it was very clear that the principles of domain-driven design were there, maybe more strongly than in the way I described it in the book. And there have been various books, too, in addition to mine, and event storming. There's a really different way of going at this, this need to collaborate with business people. And this, that's a very hard problem. Or the trying to understand what your core is and things like that. And other things, too. Now comes microservices. I made one version of this where the microservice thing swelled up and covered the whole slide, because that could easily happen. With any of these things, it could, but let's not let fear drive things. One thing that we have, and that's developed over this time, is a community, quite a vibrant community. And that's essential, because you can't deal with something like, say, that juggernaut of microservices or any of these things. It's not a thing for one person or three people to do. So, related to all this that I'm saying is that if we have to stay open to the possibility of being wrong about things. So when things fail, and things do fail, projects that I've been involved with have failed, and it's very important to acknowledge those failures, because you might be wrong. Now, it's hard to interpret failure. Sometimes things don't fail because your fundamental approach is wrong. Sometimes you were just, it was in the wrong place. Or the team wasn't well skilled, or they just didn't do it right. You see that a lot. But it's all too easy to, of course, just say, oh yeah, that was a failure because they didn't do it right. That team could have never succeeded. Sometimes you just fail. It's just bad luck. The world is a very complicated and messy place. And I think that random events are a much more prominent part of what's going on around us than we usually think. Or there might be a real cause, but it's something mysterious that we'll never know about. Something that happened in a room one day. But then, some of those failures are the result of some weak techniques or some aspect of DDD that we don't have good techniques for. And even though our principle might be right, our approach to it might not be adequate. This is one reason that I say, let's get better at at context mapping and describing bounded context, I still think that principle is sound and important, but I think we need to do it better. And then finally, there is the case where one of your basic principles is flawed. I don't think that that's the case for domain-driven design, but if it is, we can either adapt or we can just say, oh, well, I guess we had a good 15 years and it's time to find something else. But the worst thing to do would be to just wipe it under the rug. It's so easy to do because you can just put it in one of those other categories. I made a whole list. We got a list of excuses there. So we don't just want a community, the club. We want an intellectually honest, community that can, really explore this approach as skeptics and also as enthusiasts at the same time. DDD is a kind of applied philosophy. It is emphatically not a religion. And therefore, if we don't get the results we expect, we should really say, well, why didn't we get the results we expect? Did we just do it wrong? Or was one of our principles wrong? Or one of our techniques just doesn't really work, but the principle's okay? Or we just had bad luck. Another thing that's important is, of course, that the applicability of the technique doesn't cover everything. Not all software projects should be done with domain-driven design. We've always said that, and I think we've kind of sketched out limits. For example, there should be some domain complexity. It's probably not applicable to very simple projects or even relatively large ones where there's not any intricacy, but just a lot of repetition. So there are some limits that we've already mapped out, but getting better at that's always good. And of course, we won't and shouldn't agree about everything. Hopefully we can mostly agree about what the words mean. I think that part is important. Otherwise, we can't have intelligent conversations about all those other things. So, having said that, and with the goal to get that kind of community, I'll say that basically what I've said before, that domain-driven design is a set of guiding principles, and the main ones are to focus on the core domain, not the technology, not all the peripheral domain-related stuff in equal measure, but that core that really matters to the business. To be exploratory, focus, developing models, but in an exploratory way, in a collaboration with domain experts. So it's not a thing that technical people do by themselves, and it's not a thing that business people do by themselves. It's truly a product of collaboration. And that we are very language-oriented. We're trying to create this ubiquitous language, this language with the right level of rigor that can express the domain problem and solution within an bounded context. And the set of those bounded contexts would solve our problems, our software problems within that business. So that's what domain-driven design is, I think. I think that definition is pretty close to the sweet spot. It's not a perfect definition, I'm sure. But then, nothing's perfect. That is very practical. So on that note, I will say let's all go and get better at DDD. And let's shake it up a little bit and renew it. And it's an exciting world with a lot of opportunities at this moment. So thank you very much.